Hello and welcome to the Vailrun Tapes. Every story here is true. It happened to a real person, and they wrote it down or said it out loud, so the rest of us would know. Tonight, I'll share a few of them with you. A lot of you come back here every night, and that means a lot to me. These stories stay with people. That's just what they do. Before we start, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. I read all of them. And if you like these stories, a quick like and subscribe really help. Now get comfortable, take a slow breath, and let's begin.
My girlfriend still does not believe me about what I saw on that bridge. We had gone out for a walk one evening, and were making our way back home when we decided to stop for a short rest. The bridge was very old, at least a few hundred years old, and crossed over a river. It was the kind of bridge that felt different at night than it did during the day. In daylight, it was simply an old piece of the town. People walked across it, cars passed over it, and the river moved beneath it, as it always had. At night, with fewer people around, its age became much more noticeable. The stone looked darker. The river below became almost impossible to see clearly. The sound of the water seemed farther away than it really was. By then, it was around 10 o'clock. It was not extremely late, but the streets had become quiet. Only a few people were still walking around. And at that particular moment, my girlfriend and I appeared to be alone on the bridge. There were no benches or proper places to sit. That did not matter to my girlfriend. When she decides she wants to rest, she will sit almost anywhere. So we sat down on the ground beside each other, with our backs against one of the bridge walls. The walls had sections built into them that I can only describe as alcoves. They were shallow, recessed areas in the stone, probably part of the original design of the bridge. We were sitting inside one of those spaces. Because of the walls around us, my view was limited. I could see the road directly in front of us and part of the opposite wall, but I could not easily see very far in either direction along the bridge. Anyone approaching from the side would have been hidden until they passed directly in front of the alcove. At the time, I did not find that uncomfortable. We were only stopping for a few minutes. My girlfriend was beside me, and although the bridge was quiet, we were not in some completely isolated location. We talked while resting. I do not remember what the conversation was about. It was probably something ordinary from the walk, or what we planned to do once we got home. I was looking ahead toward the road when I saw something emerge into view. At first, I thought it was a cloud of mist. It moved from one side of the bridge to the other, crossing the road diagonally. The entire thing happened very quickly. From the moment it appeared to the moment it disappeared, I would estimate that only about 4 seconds passed. But calling it a cloud does not describe it properly. A normal cloud of fog or mist spreads out. It drifts unevenly. Its edges break apart and move with the wind. What I saw was tall and thin. It had roughly the height and width of a grown adult. There were no visible arms, legs, or head. There was no face. It was simply a vertical shape made of pale mist. The form moved across the bridge at what looked like a brisk walking pace. It did not float aimlessly. It did not spread across the road. It traveled in a clear direction, as though it knew exactly where it was going. The shape crossed diagonally in front of us and reached the wall on the opposite side. Then it seemed to pass directly through the stone. It did not rise over the wall. It did not stop beside it. It did not break apart against it. It disappeared through it. The moment I understood what I had just seen, I reacted. I said something like, "Oh my God," and jumped to my feet. My girlfriend looked at me, confused. She had not been watching the road at the exact moment it happened. Perhaps she had been looking down, checking something, or facing slightly toward me. She saw my reaction, but not the thing that caused it. I crossed the road immediately. I wanted to catch another glimpse before it disappeared completely. I looked over the opposite wall toward the river below. There was nothing there. No cloud drifting downward. No person climbing over the edge. No bird or animal. No smoke rising from the water. I looked along the bridge in both directions. It was empty. Whatever I had seen was gone. My girlfriend asked what was wrong. I told her that a tall cloud of mist had crossed the road directly in front of us and passed through the opposite wall. She did not believe me. I cannot blame her completely. She had been sitting beside me and had seen nothing. From her point of view, I had suddenly shouted, jumped up, and run across the road to stare into the river. There had been no footsteps, voice, or other sound to support what I described. Nothing remained for me to point at. It had lasted only a few seconds. Even as I tried to explain it, the description sounded ridiculous. A human-sized cloud walking across an old bridge. If someone else told me that story without evidence, I would probably search for an ordinary explanation, too. My first thought was fog from the river. Old bridges often have damp air around them. The temperature above the water can be different from the temperature on the road. Mist may rise suddenly and drift across a bridge, especially at night. A narrow patch of fog could appear more solid against the darkness. Wind could push it diagonally. When it reached the opposite wall, it might have moved over the edge so quickly that from my angle, it appeared to pass through the stone. That explanation is possible. It may even be the most likely one. But the shape did not behave like river mist. It was too contained. The top and bottom seemed to move together. It maintained roughly the same height and width as it crossed. I did not see wisps breaking away. There was no wider fog around us. The air had not seemed especially misty before or afterward. The bridge itself remained clear. If a patch of fog had risen from the river, I would expect it to drift upward, spread, or change shape. This moved like a person. That was the part I struggled to communicate to my girlfriend. I was not only saying that I saw mist, I saw something made of mist cross the road with the pace and direction of someone walking. There was a rhythm to it, although there were no visible legs. The shape moved smoothly, but purposefully. It seemed to pass from one side of the bridge to the other because that was where it intended to go. Of course, intention may have existed only in my interpretation. Human beings naturally recognize familiar movement patterns. A plastic bag blowing across a road can briefly look like an animal. A shadow moving behind a curtain can resemble a person. A narrow cloud pushed by a steady gust might appear to walk simply because its speed matches human movement. My brain may have taken a shapeless object and assigned it a body. The setting probably influenced me too. We were sitting on a bridge that had stood for centuries. Countless people had crossed it before us. Some of them must have fallen into the river. Others may have died nearby. Old structures encourage the imagination. Even when you do not consciously believe they are haunted, their history creates an atmosphere. A strange movement on a modern road might be dismissed as litter or exhaust. The same movement on a centuries-old bridge becomes a ghost. I understand that. But I was not thinking about ghosts before I saw it. We had not been discussing hauntings. My girlfriend and I were not searching for paranormal activity. I did not go to the bridge expecting something unusual. The site appeared in the middle of an ordinary walk. Another possibility is vehicle exhaust. A car may have passed shortly before we sat down, leaving a cloud in the cooler night air. Exhaust can form dense white vapor and move unpredictably. If the wind pushed it across the bridge, it might remain compact for several seconds. But there were very few vehicles around. I do not remember a car passing immediately before the shape appeared. Exhaust also usually hangs low and spreads horizontally. What I saw stood upright. It reached roughly the height of an adult. It was not a low cloud rolling over the road. Someone may have been smoking nearby. A large cloud of smoke could have entered my limited line of sight from one side of the alcove and crossed in front of me. But the amount of smoke would have been unusual. It would also have dispersed quickly rather than holding a tall shape. I did not smell cigarette smoke, fire, or anything burning. There was no one visible nearby who could have produced it. Steam from a drain or pipe is another explanation. Perhaps warm air rose through an opening beside the bridge and was caught by the wind. The alcove limited my view, so I might not have seen where it originated. It could have risen in a vertical column, crossed the road, and dropped over the opposite wall. That might create exactly the appearance I remember. But I never noticed steam in that location before. There was no obvious vent, grate, or pipe. The shape entered from the side rather than rising directly from the road. It seemed already formed when it appeared in my view. Light may also have played a role. Street lights, headlights, and reflections from the river can create moving shapes. A person walking somewhere outside my direct view might have cast a pale shadow or reflection across a patch of mist. The combined effect could resemble a tall figure. If the person continued behind the bridge wall, the image would disappear at the same moment, giving the illusion that the mist passed through stone. Because we were inside the alcove, I could not see the source. That is a reasonable possibility. The human-like movement may have belonged to an actual pedestrian hidden by the stonework. I saw only their reflected or illuminated outline. However, I did not hear footsteps. There was no person visible when I stood up. The bridge was open enough that someone crossing nearby should have appeared once I moved out of the alcove. Unless they turned quickly or continued along a lower path, they would not have vanished completely. The shape itself was also pale and cloudy, not a shadow. It appeared to have substance, although not a solid body. Another explanation is that I saw an insect or object very close to my eyes. A moth, spider web, or piece of dust near my face could appear large and out of focus. As it moved across my vision, my brain might have placed it farther away on the road. When it left my line of sight, it seemed to disappear into the opposite wall. This kind of depth mistake happens more easily in darkness because there are fewer visual references. A small pale object a few inches away can look like a large form several yards away. But the movement seemed connected to the physical space of the bridge. I watched it enter from one side, cross the road surface, and reach the far wall. My eyes followed it naturally. It did not feel like something floating near my face. I also moved immediately to the location where it disappeared because I believed it had crossed the bridge. Still, perception can be convincing and wrong. A visual migraine or eye floater may cause shapes to move across someone's vision. A tall, blurred patch could remain for several seconds and vanish. If that happened, the bridge had nothing to do with it. The shape existed inside my visual system. However, I did not experience a headache, flashing lights, blind spots, or any other visual disturbance. The form appeared fixed in the external world. When I turned my head, I continued tracking it across the road. I have not experienced the same thing in other places. Fatigue may have contributed. It was around 10 at night after a long walk. I may have been tired and briefly misinterpreted what I saw. Low light reduces detail, and the brain fills in missing information. The shape had no features because there were no features to see. My mind recognized only its height, width, and movement. That was enough to create the impression of a person. This explanation is probably more realistic than an apparition, but the absence of features is exactly what made it unsettling. There was no visible face, clothing, or body. It was not a transparent man. It was not a ghost in an old-fashioned outfit. It was simply a person-shaped absence filled with mist. The thing never turned toward us. It did not react when I shouted. It did not speed up or slow down. It crossed the bridge as though we were not there. That behavior made me wonder whether, if it was paranormal, it was not conscious of us at all. Some people describe residual hauntings as old events repeating in a location. The figure is not an aware spirit. It is more like a recording. A person walks the same route they once walked while alive, unaware of the modern world around them. An old bridge would be the kind of place where such a story might develop. For hundreds of years, people crossed from one side to the other. The road level, walls, or riverbank may have changed. A path that once continued beyond the bridge might now be blocked by stone. If an old image repeated the original route, the figure could appear to walk directly through the modern wall. That interpretation fits what I saw almost too neatly. A human-sized form moved at walking speed. It followed a diagonal path. It did not acknowledge us. It disappeared through a structure. But fitting a paranormal theory does not make the theory true. I do not know whether residual hauntings exist. There is no reliable way to prove that a place stores visual impressions of the past. The idea gives meaning to an unexplained sighting, but it may only be a story placed over a natural event. The bridge's age makes the interpretation attractive. If the same thing happened in a supermarket car park, I would probably call it steam. That bias matters. I also cannot verify whether the bridge had any history of deaths, accidents, or ghost sightings. I never researched it carefully. Even if I found a story about someone dying there, that would not prove any connection. Old bridges accumulate tragedies simply because they have existed for so long. A person could always match a sighting to some event after the fact. What makes the experience difficult is how brief it was. 4 seconds is enough time to see something clearly, but not enough time to study it. I noticed the shape, followed its movement, and reacted. By the time I stood up, it was already gone. I could not compare its edges, check whether it cast a shadow, or ask my girlfriend to look. There was no chance to take a picture. The event existed only in my view. That makes my girlfriend's disbelief understandable. She was sitting beside me and did not see anything. There are 2 possible reasons. The first is that the event occurred entirely in my perception. The second is that she happened to look away during the few seconds when something real crossed in front of us. Both are possible. People miss obvious events all the time when their attention is elsewhere. A short incident can occur only a few feet away without everyone noticing. She may have been looking toward the ground or speaking. By the time my reaction made her look up, the shape had reached the wall. Her failure to see it does not prove it was not there, but it also gives me no confirmation. If we had both seen the same tall cloud follow the same path, I would feel much more certain that something external happened. Instead, I am left with a memory she cannot share. I sometimes wonder whether my reaction affected how I remember the shape. The moment I shouted and jumped up, the event became important. I searched for it, failed to find it, and then tried to explain it. Each retelling may have sharpened the form. Perhaps it was less human-shaped than I now believe. Maybe it was wider, lower, or more irregular. The comparison to an adult might have developed because that best described the way it moved. Memory does not preserve every visual detail perfectly. It reconstructs them. Still, the central image has remained consistent. Tall, thin, pale, no features, crossing diagonally at a brisk walking pace, disappearing through the wall. I can still picture the exact part of the road where it passed. I can see the opposite stonework swallowing it. I remember the immediate certainty that I had witnessed something unusual. There was no period where I stared and gradually convinced myself. My body reacted before I finished thinking. I was on my feet almost instantly. That kind of response can happen when the brain detects an unexpected movement. It does not prove danger or the paranormal, but it shows how strongly the sight registered as a real object in the environment. The river may be the key. Water creates fog, reflections, temperature changes, and moving light. The air above a river can behave differently from the air on the bridge. A narrow rising column of mist may have been caught by a crosswind. The bridge walls could have channeled the air, forcing the mist along a defined route. When it reached an opening or dropped over the far side, it disappeared. From my restricted position in the alcove, the movement appeared to end at the wall. That explanation requires no ghost and fits the setting. I have tried to visualize it that way. A patch of river mist rises. Wind carries it diagonally upward. The stone alcove hides its lower part and source. For 4 seconds, it resembles a walking person. Then it passes over the wall and falls toward the water. When I cross the road, it has already dispersed below. That may be exactly what happened. The only problem is that I remember it traveling horizontally across the road, not rising from below. It seemed to enter from one side at street level. It maintained its form until it reached the opposite wall. Maybe the wind was stronger and more organized than I realized. Air currents around old stone structures can create strange movement. Without measuring the conditions, I cannot reject that explanation. I prefer it to something supernatural. Natural mist would mean I witnessed a rare visual effect at the perfect angle. That is unusual, but not impossible. A paranormal figure raises far more questions. Who was it? Why was it crossing there? Why did it appear as mist? Why could I see it when my girlfriend could not? Why did it pass through the wall? There are no answers. The event did not continue. We did not hear voices from the river. Nothing followed us home. I never saw the shape again. After looking over the wall and along the bridge, I eventually returned to my girlfriend. She remained unconvinced. We continued home. The bridge returned to being an ordinary old bridge. Other people probably crossed it later that night without seeing anything. That normal ending makes the experience feel almost unreal. One moment, something human-sized moved across the road in front of me. The next, there was only stone, darkness, and the river below. I do not claim I saw a ghost. I saw a shape that looked like mist and moved like a person. That is the most accurate statement I can make. Everything beyond that is interpretation. Maybe it was fog. Maybe it was steam. Maybe it was a reflection, an insect close to my eyes, or a brief visual error. Maybe the alcove and the lighting created a perfect illusion. Or maybe, for a few seconds, I watched something cross a bridge by following a path that no longer existed. The old age of the structure makes that final possibility difficult to dismiss completely. Hundreds of years is a long time. People have walked across that bridge in weather, darkness, celebration, grief, and fear. Some may have stopped in the same alcove. Some may have looked into the same river. The stones have outlasted generations. If places could hold memories, that bridge would have more than most. But I know that is a thought, not evidence. My girlfriend believes I saw ordinary mist and frightened myself. Sometimes she treats the story like a joke. I understand why. She was there and saw nothing. There is no photograph, no second witness, no physical trace, only my reaction and memory. Even so, I know I did not invent the moment afterward. I saw something. It entered my limited view from the side, crossed the road in front of us, and disappeared at the far wall. It was almost exactly the size of a person. It moved quickly, but not wildly. It did not drift like smoke. It walked. I still think about what might have happened if my girlfriend had been looking in the same direction. Would she have seen it too? Would we describe the same shape? Or would she have pointed out a patch of fog and shown me how easily I had mistaken it for a figure? I wish she had seen it, even if only to give me an ordinary explanation. Instead, the timing left me alone with it. 4 seconds. That was all. Long enough for the shape to cross an entire road. Long enough for me to recognize a human outline. Too short for anyone else to turn and look. The detail that stays with me most is not the mist itself. It is the way it disappeared. If it had dissolved in the middle of the road, I could blame shifting fog. If it had risen over the wall, I would assume wind. If a person had stepped from the haze, I would know someone had been walking there. Instead, it continued at the same pace until it reached solid stone. Then it was gone. I ran to the place where it should have been. I looked into the river. Nothing moved below. No mist remained above the water. No figure stood on the bank. The bridge was empty. My girlfriend had seen only me jump up and chase something she never noticed. Maybe that is all the story is. A brief natural effect, viewed from the wrong angle by one tired person on an old bridge at night. That explanation is reasonable. I try to accept it. But whenever I remember the sight, it does not appear as a cloud. It appears as a tall, thin figure with no face and no body, crossing the road with the steady pace of someone who had made the same journey many times before. It never looked toward us. It never slowed down. And when it reached the other side, it passed through the centuries-old wall as though the stone had not been built yet. I was around 16 or 17 when a friend and I saw something hovering beside a rural road that neither of us could explain. Earlier that day, we had gone to a water park. The weather had been warm enough for swimming, but a storm eventually rolled through the area and forced everyone out of the water. Once it became clear that the weather was not going to improve quickly, my friend and I decided to leave and drive home. By the time we got on the road, the worst of the storm had already passed. The sky afterward was one of the most beautiful things I had ever seen. Bright orange clouds filled almost every direction. The entire horizon looked lit from within, as though the storm had left behind some enormous fire above us. The color was stronger than an ordinary sunset. It reflected off the remaining clouds and made the whole landscape feel different. My friend and I kept talking about it during the drive. Every few minutes, one of us would point out another section of the sky. We had both seen sunsets before, but this looked unusual enough that we could not stop discussing it. The storm clouds were still thick in places, yet they had become bright orange instead of dark gray. The atmosphere outside felt almost unreal. There was still moisture in the air, and the roads were wet from the rain. Everything seemed brighter and cleaner after the storm. By the time we reached our home city, we were hungry. Instead of going directly home, we decided to drive into town and get something to eat. I lived in a very rural area, so traveling anywhere usually meant taking narrow back roads past fields, wooded areas, and drainage ditches. There were long sections with no houses nearby. Streetlights were limited or completely absent. At night, the only light often came from the headlights of your own vehicle, a distant farmhouse, or the sky. We turned onto one of those back roads and continued toward town. The road passed beside a cornfield. There was a ditch running along the edge of the pavement, separating the road from the field. After the storm, the ditch was probably damp or partly filled with water. We were still talking about the sky when something ahead caught our attention. At first, I did not understand what I was looking at. There was a small glowing object hovering above the ditch. It was not high in the sky. It was only about 5 feet above the ground, roughly at the height of a person's chest or head. It appeared to be floating in front of the cornfield. The object was round. The best comparison I can make is a glowing orb about the size of a soccer ball. It was large enough to see clearly from the road, but small enough that it could not have been a vehicle, aircraft, or normal outdoor light. I slowed the car. My friend saw it too. Neither of us had to point it out to the other. We both began asking the same question. What is that? We repeated it several times because neither of us could come up with an answer. The object did not move away as we approached. It did not rise into the sky or drop into the ditch. It remained in place, hovering above the ground. I drove closer until the car was almost directly beside it. At that distance, I expected the mystery to disappear. I thought it might become an insect reflecting our headlights, a piece of plastic caught on a fence, or a light attached to farming equipment. Instead, it became even stranger. The orb appeared completely transparent. I could see through it. It did not look like a solid glass ball because there was no obvious outer surface reflecting a sharp image. It was more like a round area of glowing air. The light seemed to exist throughout the object rather than coming from a bulb inside it. There was no wire, no post, no visible device holding it up. It hovered over the ditch without touching anything. The cornfield behind it was dark, and the glowing sphere stood out clearly against that background. It was bright enough to be seen easily, but I do not remember it lighting the entire area like a headlight. The glow seemed contained. There was no strong beam pointing toward us. It did not flash or change colors. It was simply there. A transparent, soccer ball-sized orb floating several feet above a roadside ditch. My friend and I continued staring at it. Neither of us suggested getting out. I slowed down enough to look, but I did not stop the car completely and walk toward it. At the time, curiosity and fear were fighting each other. Part of me wanted to understand what it was. Another part told me that approaching an unexplained glowing object beside an empty cornfield was a terrible idea. We did not know whether it was electrical. It could have been connected to damaged power equipment after the storm. Perhaps a wire had fallen somewhere nearby, creating an arc or dangerous field. Getting out and touching anything near it could have resulted in serious injury. There may also have been lightning activity still in the area. I had no scientific understanding of what conditions could create a floating light after a storm, so remaining inside the vehicle felt safer. There was also something unsettling about how still it was. Most ordinary objects move in wind. A balloon would drift, mist would change shape, an insect would fly unpredictably. A reflection would move as our headlights changed position. This orb appeared fixed above the ditch. It seemed independent of our car. As I moved forward, the angle changed. But the object remained in the same physical location. That was what convinced me it was not simply something on the windshield. If it had been a reflection inside the car, it would have moved with us. My friend saw it from another seat, which also ruled out many visual effects limited to my position. We passed beside it slowly. For a few seconds, it was directly outside the car. I tried to examine its edges. I remember the shape being unusually perfect. It was not an irregular cloud or a loose circle of light. It was round in a way that reminded me of a ball. Yet, it did not appear solid. The transparency was one of the hardest details to describe later. People understand a glowing ball if it is a lamp, drone, or piece of glass. This looked as though the air itself had formed a sphere and begun producing light. We continued toward town. Neither of us had an explanation. For the rest of the drive, we talked about almost nothing else. We questioned whether the storm could have caused it. Maybe it was some form of ball lightning. We had heard stories about glowing spheres appearing during or after storms, though neither of us knew much about the phenomenon. Ball lightning is often described as a floating orb of light that appears near thunderstorms. Some accounts describe it moving through the air, hovering briefly, or disappearing suddenly. That seemed close to what we had seen. But the storm had already passed. There had been no visible lightning strike near the ditch while we were approaching. The orb also remained still long enough for us to slow down and inspect it. I do not remember hearing a crack, buzz, or electrical sound. There was no smell of burning or ozone inside the car. It did not explode or vanish while we watched. It simply remained behind as we continued driving. A normal light source was another possibility. Someone could have placed a solar garden light, lantern, or reflective marker near the field. The storm may have knocked it loose and left it hanging from a wire or plant. From the road, the support could have been too thin or dark to see. A transparent plastic object could catch light from our headlights and appear to glow. But the orb was too far from any obvious structure. There was no fence post directly beneath it that I remember. The ditch and cornfield were open. If the light came only from our headlights, its appearance should have changed as we passed. Instead, it continued glowing from every angle we could see. It may have been a balloon. A clear balloon filled with moisture could reflect the orange sky or headlights. It might have been tied to a hidden string near the ditch. A transparent balloon could look like a floating orb, especially after dark. But a balloon would probably move in the remaining wind after a storm. Its surface would also reflect sharper points of light. What we saw seemed illuminated from within. A soap bubble crossed my mind later because of the transparency and perfect round shape. Large bubbles can reflect colors and seem almost luminous. But a bubble the size of a soccer ball would not remain perfectly still 5 feet above a wet ditch for long. It would drift, deform, or burst. It also would not produce a steady glow unless the lighting conditions were extremely specific. An insect swarm or spider web could create strange reflections. Water droplets on a web sometimes shine brightly in headlights. A web stretched between plants might be nearly invisible, except for a rounded section reflecting light. However, the object looked three-dimensional. It did not seem attached to the corn or weeds. We saw a complete sphere rather than a flat circle. Fog or water vapor after the storm may have created the shape. A small patch of mist could have hovered above the warmer ditch water. Our headlights in the orange sky might have illuminated it from different directions, making it appear round. Air currents sometimes form organized shapes or vortices, but mist rarely stays inside such a clear, spherical boundary. It should have spread or shifted. The object also appeared transparent in a more structured way than ordinary fog. There may have been something reflective on the opposite side of the ditch that we could not see. The glowing circle might have been an optical illusion caused by light passing through water droplets in the air. Rainbows, halos, and other atmospheric effects can appear after storms when light interacts with moisture. A small fog bow or reflection from our headlights could have formed at a particular angle. But both my friend and I continued to see the orb as the car changed position. An optical effect dependent on our viewing angle should have shifted or disappeared more quickly. I also wondered whether it could have been a drone. Modern drones can hover steadily and carry bright lights. A transparent protective frame around the light might create a glowing sphere. But this happened when drones were less common, especially in rural areas. I did not hear propellers. The object did not show separate red, green, or white navigation lights. There was no visible frame. It was also hovering very low over a ditch with no apparent reason for anyone to operate it there. A small remote-controlled aircraft could have been used by a farmer or hobbyist, but the silence and shape did not fit anything I knew. We eventually reached town, bought our food, and prepared to return home. By then, enough time had passed that both of us wanted to know whether the orb was still there. We took the same road back. Part of me expected to see emergency vehicles near the field. If an electrical line had fallen, someone might have reported it. If it was a damaged piece of equipment, the light could still be glowing. If it was ball lightning or another temporary weather phenomenon, it would probably be gone. As we approached the location, we slowed again. The ditch was empty. The orb had disappeared. There was no light above the ground, no balloon caught in the grass, no lantern, sign, or reflective object. The cornfield looked completely ordinary. We searched the area from the car as we passed, but there was nothing to indicate what had been there. That absence made the original sighting feel even more unreal. Only a short time earlier, a glowing sphere had been hovering in a clearly visible spot. Now the darkness had returned. If the object had been physical, someone or something had removed it. If it had been an atmospheric event, the conditions had ended. If it had been a visual illusion, the changing light or moisture no longer produced it. We did not stop and search the ditch on foot. It was dark, wet, and rural. Walking beside a cornfield at night after a storm did not seem worth the risk. There could have been deep water, electrical wires, animals, or unstable ground. We continued home. The moment we entered the house, we told my mother what we had seen. We described the size. We told her it had been floating several feet above the ditch. We explained that it was glowing, but transparent. She laughed and shrugged it off. From her perspective, two teenagers had driven through strange post-storm lighting and become excited about something beside a field. She probably assumed we had seen a reflection, a balloon, or farm equipment. There was no photograph or video. We had not touched it. By the time we returned, it was gone. There was nothing she could examine. I understood why she was skeptical, but my friend and I had both seen the same thing. We had looked at it from close range. We had spoken about it while it was still in front of us. This was not a memory created days later after one person suggested an explanation. We were both immediately confused. What is that? Neither of us could answer. Over the years, I have returned to ball lightning as the most interesting possible explanation. It is associated with storms and is often described as a glowing sphere ranging from small to several feet across. Some reports say it lasts for several seconds. Others claim it can hover, move slowly, or disappear without warning. A soccer ball-sized orb appearing after a storm and vanishing later seems to match those descriptions. But I do not know enough to say that is what happened. Ball lightning itself is poorly understood and difficult to confirm. Many reported examples may have ordinary electrical, atmospheric, or visual explanations. Calling the orb ball lightning gives it a name, but does not prove the cause. The fact that it was only around 5 feet above the ground may support an electrical phenomenon. The wet ditch, saturated soil, and nearby field could have influenced local electrical conditions. The storm might have left charge in the atmosphere. Perhaps lightning had struck nearby before we arrived. A slowly decaying electrical discharge could have appeared as a sphere. However, I would expect such a phenomenon to be unstable. The orb we saw seemed calm. It did not flicker, move, or make noise. It appeared almost too perfect. Another possibility is St. Elmo's fire, an electrical glow that can form around pointed objects during strong atmospheric electric fields. It sometimes appears blue or violet and may occur around ships, aircraft, or tall structures. But the light normally clings to an object. It does not form a separate soccer ball-sized sphere hovering over a ditch. There may have been a plant, metal rod, or fence wire inside the glow that we could not see, but nothing obvious was visible. Swamp gas is another explanation people offer for floating lights near wet ground. Certain gases released by decaying organic material can ignite or create faint luminous effects under rare conditions. Stories of will-o'-the-wisps often come from marshes, bogs, and ditches. After heavy rain, the field and drainage area may have been wet enough to produce strange lights. But the scientific explanations for those reports are uncertain, and a large, stable, transparent orb seems different from a small, flickering flame. The object did not behave like fire. It had no visible smoke. It did not change shape in the breeze. There were no orange or blue flames. It was a white or clear glow contained in a round form. People sometimes connect unexplained orbs with paranormal activity. They describe spirits, energy, or entities appearing as balls of light. The rural location, unusual sky, and timing after the storm made that interpretation tempting. The whole evening already felt charged. The clouds had turned bright orange in every direction. Then, on an empty back road, we found a light hovering in front of a dark cornfield. It looked like something placed there for us to notice. But there was no evidence that it was intelligent. It did not follow the car. It did not react when we approached. It did not move toward us or communicate. It remained in one spot and was gone when we returned. Calling it a spirit would be no more supportive than calling it an alien device. The UFO explanation also comes up when people hear about glowing orbs. A small probe or object might hover near the ground and disappear later. But we saw nothing mechanical. There were no sounds, movements, or other aircraft nearby. The orb was only the size of a soccer ball. It may have looked strange, but nothing about its behavior suggested technology beyond its ability to remain suspended. A hidden drone or light source is far more likely than an extraterrestrial object. I have also considered whether the post-storm sky affected our vision. We had spent a long time looking at intense orange clouds. Strong colors can create afterimages. If you stare at a bright area, you may later see a complementary colored spot floating in your vision. Perhaps both of us experienced some kind of visual after effect. But afterimages move with the eyes. They do not remain in a fixed roadside location as a car approaches and passes. My friend and I would also be unlikely to experience an identical afterimage at exactly the same spot. There was clearly some external visual source. The only question is whether we interpreted it correctly. Distance and darkness may have distorted the size. What appeared to be 5 feet above the ground might have been attached to a tall weed closer to us. What looked soccer ball sized might have been much smaller and nearer to the road, or much larger and farther into the field. Without reference points, night vision can be unreliable. Our headlights may have flattened the scene. A reflective object hanging from a plant could seem suspended in open space. The transparency might have resulted from seeing the dark background through clear plastic. A clear discarded container, weather balloon, or farming material could fit many details. The storm may have blown it into the ditch. Later, another gust could have moved it away. That may be the most ordinary explanation. Yet I remember slowing until we were directly beside it. At that distance, it did not look like trash. There was no obvious plastic surface folding or moving. It held a perfect spherical shape. It glowed steadily. My friend was just as confused as I was. We had every reason to identify a normal roadside object and continue. Instead, we kept asking what it was. Memory can strengthen the strange parts over time. I was young, and the event happened after an emotionally intense drive through unusual weather. The orb may not have been as perfectly round or transparent as I now remember. Perhaps it flickered slightly. Maybe it moved in the wind. The distance could have been greater. The size may have been different. I cannot treat a memory from years ago as a precise measurement, but the central details have never changed. It was round. It glowed. It hovered several feet above the ditch. Both of us saw it. It was gone when we returned. I sometimes wish I had stopped the car and taken a photograph. Even a poor phone camera image might have captured something. At the time, however, camera phones were not always available or good enough for low-light conditions. A photograph might have shown only darkness and a bright, blurry spot. It may not have explained anything. Getting out and walking closer would have provided more information, but it could also have been dangerous if the source was electrical. Staying in the car was probably the smarter choice. The experience remains one of those memories that becomes stranger because nothing else happened. There was no dramatic ending. The orb did not shoot into the sky. It did not explode. It did not follow us home. It simply existed beside the road for a short period, then disappeared before we came back. That quiet behavior makes it feel almost natural. Maybe it was a rare atmospheric effect produced by the storm. Perhaps we happened to drive past at the exact moment it formed. A few minutes earlier or later, we would have seen nothing. That possibility is fascinating enough without requiring a supernatural explanation. The world can produce events most people never witness because the conditions must align perfectly. Wet ground, charged air, changing temperature. The final light of sunset. A drainage ditch beside a cornfield. Some interaction among those things may have created the orb. I would like to believe there's a scientific answer. But I have never found one that matches every detail. Whenever I think about that evening, I first remember the sky. The clouds were bright orange in every direction, and my friend and I could not stop talking about how unusual they looked. The entire drive felt as though we were traveling beneath a different atmosphere. Then, the road narrowed. The houses disappeared, and the cornfields began. In front of one dark field, hovering above a wet ditch, was a transparent sphere of light. We slowed down until it was beside us. It was close enough to examine, but strange enough that neither of us wanted to leave the car. We went into town, bought our food, and returned by the same route. The ditch was empty. My mother laughed when we told her. Years later, I still have no better explanation than I did that night. Maybe it was ball lightning. Maybe it was a clear object reflecting the post-storm sky. Maybe the storm created some rare effect in the wet air above the field. Those are all possible. But whatever it was, it remained perfectly still as we approached, glowing through its transparent body like a ball of light suspended in the air. And when we came back, the road was dark again, as though it had never been there at all. When I was around 10 years old, I was playing outside near the street at the edge of the suburb where my family lived. It was the middle of the day, bright and clear, and I did not feel unsafe. Our neighborhood was the kind of place where children regularly played outside without adults standing beside them every second. I knew the streets, recognized most of the houses, and understood that if I needed help, my home was not far away. A new Walmart had recently opened around 10 minutes from where we lived. Everyone in the area knew about it. People were still learning the fastest route, and it was common to hear neighbors discussing the new store. While I was near the road, an older car pulled up beside me. I do not remember the exact make, model, or color anymore. What I remember most is that the vehicle looked old, and a man was driving it. He slowed down and stopped close enough to speak to me. Then he rolled down his window. He asked me how to get to Walmart. At first, the situation did not seem especially strange. Adults sometimes asked people for directions before smartphones and navigation apps became common. The store was new, so it made sense that someone might not know where it was. I was only a child, but I knew the general route. I stood where I was and began explaining it. The man responded by saying, "What?" He acted as though he could not hear me. I repeated the directions, probably speaking louder. Again, he said, "What?" The sun was bright, and the inside of the car was much darker than the street around it. Because of the difference in lighting, I could not see the interior clearly. I could see the driver, but much of the space behind him looked dark. At the time, I did not think that mattered. I only thought the man was having trouble hearing me. I moved a little closer and repeated the directions. He still acted as though he could not understand. Each time I spoke, he made me feel as though I needed to come nearer. I was young and wanted to be helpful. I also did not want to seem rude by walking away while someone was asking me a simple question. So I moved closer to the car. Looking back, I understand how dangerous that was. At 10 years old, I was small enough that an adult could have grabbed me quickly. The car was already running, and the driver could have left the area within seconds. There was no reason for him to get out or create a scene. All he needed was for me to come close enough to the open window. At the time, I did not think through any of that. I was concentrating on giving him the directions correctly. I moved closer again and repeated myself. Then, something inside me changed. There was no obvious event that caused it. The man did not suddenly reveal a weapon. He did not open the door. He did not say anything openly threatening. I simply felt an overwhelming urge to get away from the car. The feeling was immediate and physical. A moment earlier, I was trying to help. Then, every part of me seemed to understand that I needed to create distance. It did not feel like an ordinary thought. It felt like a warning. I backed away from the window. I told the man that my mother needed me. I do not know whether my mother had actually called me or whether I invented the excuse automatically. Saying she needed me created a reason to leave without directly accusing him of anything. It also let him know that an adult might be nearby and expecting me. As I moved backward, the man said something else. I could not hear what it was. He may have asked another question. He might have told me to come closer. Perhaps he was only thanking me or trying to confirm the directions. I will never know. I did not stop to ask him to repeat it. I turned and began walking back toward my house. I tried not to run immediately because I did not want him to know how frightened I had become. I was aware of the car behind me. I kept expecting to hear the engine move or a door open. I imagined the vehicle pulling ahead and blocking my path. Nothing happened right away. After walking a short distance, I looked back. From that angle, I could see through the rear window. There appeared to be a second person sitting in the back seat. I saw only an outline. The person was difficult to make out because the inside of the car remained dark compared with the bright daylight outside. I could not identify their face, age, or clothing. But the shape looked human. Someone seemed to be sitting in the rear of the vehicle. That frightened me, because while I had been standing close to the driver's window, I had believed he was alone. I could have sworn there was no one else in the car. Now, after I had moved away, a second figure was visible in the back seat. The person had been hidden in the exact part of the car where a child might be pulled if someone reached through the window or opened the rear door. I continued toward home. I do not remember whether the car drove away immediately or remained there for a little longer. My attention was focused on reaching the house. Once I was inside, I told my mother what had happened. I explained that a man had stopped and asked for directions. I told her he repeatedly claimed he could not hear me, causing me to move closer. I also told her that after I walked away, I saw the outline of someone sitting in the back seat. My mother believed me about the car and the man. She believed that someone had stopped and spoken to me. She did not think the second person was real. She suggested I had imagined the outline or mistaken a headrest, shadow, or object for someone sitting in the back. That was possible. The bright sunlight could have reflected off the rear glass. The dark interior may have created a human-looking shape from almost anything. A coat hanging from a seat, a pile of belongings, or the headrest itself might have looked like a person from a distance. I was already frightened by then. Fear can make ordinary shapes appear threatening. Perhaps I looked back expecting danger, and my mind created a second person where there was none. For years, I accepted that explanation more easily than the alternative. I thought of the experience as a strange encounter with a man who genuinely could not hear my directions. Maybe he had hearing problems. Perhaps the road was noisy. His engine may have been loud. I might have been speaking too quietly. He may have asked me to repeat myself because he truly did not understand. The second figure could have been nothing more than a shadow. If that was all, the situation was uncomfortable, but harmless. As I got older, though, I began to understand why my instincts had reacted so strongly. The man already had enough information to reach the store. Even if my first explanation was unclear, he could have asked me to point, name a road, or repeat one part. He did not need a 10-year-old child to walk close to his window. The repeated what? May have been a way to reduce the distance between us. Each time I spoke, he gave me a reason to move closer. He remained inside the car where he had control over the situation. I was outside, alone and exposed. The possibility that another person was hiding in the back seat made the encounter much worse. If the driver intended to abduct someone, having a second adult in the car would make it easier. One person could keep control of the vehicle while the other grabbed the child. The dark interior would keep the second person hidden until it was too late. That interpretation made me feel sick when I was old enough to recognize it. I began wondering how close I had actually been. Could the man have reached my arm through the window? Was the rear door already unlocked? Had the person in the back seat been waiting for me to move another step? I do not remember the exact distance now. Childhood memories do not preserve measurements perfectly. I may have been several feet away the entire time, or I may have been close enough for the driver to touch me. The fact that I cannot know is disturbing. I also wonder what caused the sudden urge to leave. It may have been my brain noticing small details before I consciously understood them. People often describe instinct as something mysterious, but the mind constantly processes information beneath conscious awareness. The man's tone may have been wrong. His eyes may have been focused on me rather than the road. Perhaps he was not behaving like someone who genuinely needed directions. Maybe he looked toward the back seat. The car may have been positioned strangely. I might have noticed the outline of the second person earlier without fully recognizing it. All of those details could have combined into a warning before I could explain why. My body reacted first. The reasoning came years later. That does not mean the man definitely intended to harm me. It is important to separate possibility from proof. I did not see him reach for me. He did not follow me into the house. I did not hear him threaten me. The second person may not have existed. The driver may genuinely have been lost and hard of hearing. There are innocent explanations for everything that happened. But a child does not need proof of bad intentions before moving away from an adult who makes them uncomfortable. Leaving was the correct decision, even if the man was harmless. The risk of seeming rude was nothing compared with the risk of staying. At 10 years old, I did not understand that clearly. I only knew I suddenly wanted distance. I am grateful I listened to that feeling. I sometimes imagine what could have happened if I had ignored it. Perhaps the man would have heard the directions after I moved one step closer, thanked me, and driven away. Maybe nothing dangerous would have occurred. But if my later interpretation is correct, that additional step might have been enough. A hand could have come through the window. A rear door could have opened. The second person could have moved before I had time to react. Even if I screamed, the car could have been gone quickly. Our neighborhood felt safe because it was familiar, but familiarity would not have protected me once I was inside a stranger's vehicle. The new Walmart may also have been a convenient excuse. Because it had recently opened, asking for directions sounded believable. The man did not need to invent a complicated story. Almost anyone in the area would know where it was. A child would feel useful by explaining the route. The request also gave him a reason to stop without immediately appearing suspicious. I do not know whether he selected me specifically. He may have driven past and noticed a child alone near the street. Perhaps he had asked other children the same question. Maybe he was only passing through and truly lost. There was no later report that I know of. My family did not hear about another child being approached. The police were not involved, at least not from what I remember. Without a license plate, detailed description, or photograph, there would have been little to investigate anyway. I wish I remembered more about the car. The color, the shape, the driver's age, his clothing, the sound of his voice, whether the passenger moved. At 10, I did not know those details might become important. I remembered the fear instead. That is common in frightening childhood events. The emotional moment remains clear while practical information disappears. I can still picture the bright daylight reflecting against the car windows. I can still hear the man saying, "What?" I remember repeating the directions and moving closer. Then I remember the sudden certainty that I needed to leave. The figure in the back seat remains less clear. It was only an outline. That uncertainty is why I cannot claim there were definitely two people in the car. My mother may have been right. I could have seen the rear headrest. Older cars often had large seats and dark interiors. The angle through the back window could have made an empty seat look occupied. Reflections of trees, houses, or even my own body may have crossed the glass. Once I became afraid, my mind interpreted the shape as a person. Yet the outline did not feel like a random shadow. I remember recognizing shoulders and a head. The figure seemed positioned low in the seat, almost as though they had been trying not to be visible while I stood near the front window. That may be a detail strengthened by later understanding. When people revisit memories, they sometimes add meaning that was not clear at the time. After learning about attempted abductions, I may have reconstructed the passenger as someone deliberately hiding. The original site might have been much more uncertain. I try to remain honest about that. Even if there was no passenger, the driver's behavior was enough to justify leaving. An adult can ask a child for directions without repeatedly encouraging them to approach. He had a car. He could have driven to a gas station, store, or house and asked another adult. He could have rolled the window down farther, turned off the engine, or spoken louder. Instead, the responsibility was placed on me to move closer. That is the part I would warn any child about now. Adults should not need help from children in ways that require the child to enter their personal space. A safe adult will understand if a child keeps their distance. They will not pressure them to approach a vehicle. They will not make the child feel responsible for solving the adult's problem. The man may not have understood how his behavior looked. But a child should still leave. I also think my excuse about my mother helped. By saying she needed me, I created the possibility that someone was watching. If the man had bad intentions, he now had to consider that an adult might appear at any moment. My house was close enough for me to reach quickly. The situation became less controlled from his perspective. Perhaps that is why the car did not follow. Again, that assumes criminal intent. But even without knowing the truth, mentioning a nearby adult was a smart response. I did not plan it. The words came automatically. Instinct may not always be accurate, but it can be protective. Fear does not need to win an argument before you listen to it. If a situation feels wrong, leaving is enough. Years later, when I finally understood what may have been happening, I felt physically sick. The memory changed. What had once been a strange conversation became a possible attempt to lure me close to a car. The man's repeated inability to hear no longer seemed innocent. The dark shape in the rear seat no longer seemed like a small detail. I understood how quickly a child could disappear. I also understood how easily the adults around them might initially believe they had wandered away voluntarily. No one had seen me speaking to the man. There may have been no witnesses. If the car had driven off with me inside, my mother might not have known what kind of vehicle to search for. The thought is horrible. But I survived the encounter, and nothing happened beyond the conversation. That matters too. I do not want to turn an uncertain memory into a confirmed crime. The man may have driven away frustrated because he still did not understand the directions. The second person may have been a coat. The danger may have existed only in what could have happened. Sometimes that is enough to make a story frightening. You do not need to see the attack. You only need to realize years later how close you may have been to one. My mother believed the important part. She believed a man had stopped and spoken to me. Even if she doubted the passenger, she did not accuse me of inventing the whole event. I was able to tell someone. That helped the memory feel real rather than like a dream. I wish she had taken down more details or reported the car, but it is easy to judge past decisions with adult knowledge. At the time, I was safely home. No one had touched me. The vehicle was gone. There was no proof of a crime. Parents also do not want to believe their children came close to something terrible. Thinking, I imagined the person in the back seat may have been easier for her than accepting the alternative. I do not know what happened to the driver afterward. Maybe he reached Walmart. Maybe he approached another child. Perhaps he was completely innocent and never realized he frightened me. Or perhaps my decision to back away forced him to abandon whatever he had planned. There is no ending beyond the one I created by leaving. That may be the reason the event still returns to me. The danger remained only a possibility. There was no clear moment when the man revealed himself. No chase, no police report, no confession. Only a child standing beside an old car in bright daylight while a stranger repeatedly asked him to come closer. Then, an instinctive warning, a quick excuse, a walk back toward home, and one final look through the rear window. I still do not know whether the second person was real. I hope my mother was right, and that fear turned a shadow into a passenger. But I am grateful I did not stay long enough to find out. At 10 years old, I thought I was only giving directions to Walmart. Years later, I realized the man may never have cared where Walmart was. He may only have been waiting to see how close I would come.
Quick pause, then we're right back. A lot of people watch one story and leave, but some stick around. They hit subscribe and come back every night. If you want to be one of them, the button's right there. Turn on the bell too, so you never miss a new one. That's it. Let's get back to the story.
We were out late one night, around 10 o'clock, walking with our friend to his house. There were three of us together. I will call my friends F1 and F2. F2's parents did not like him coming home late by himself. They worried about him walking alone at night, so F1 and I usually went with him when it got dark. That evening, there was a party at the local culture house. I am not sure what the exact English word is for the place. It was a community building that people could rent for parties, weddings, meetings, and other events. The lights were on, music was playing, and several adults were there. F1's mother was attending the party, so before we left, we told her that we were going to walk F2 home. She gave us permission. That made us feel unusually free. We were still young, and being allowed to walk around at 10 at night felt exciting. During the day, the streets in our area were familiar and ordinary. At night, the same roads felt completely different. There were fewer people outside. Most house windows were dark. The spaces between streetlights seemed much larger than they did during the day. We were not especially frightened because there were three of us. We talked, joked, and probably acted more confident than we really felt. The main road to F2's house took longer. There was another route through the cemetery that would save time. We knew the cemetery and had passed it many times before. During the day, it did not seem particularly frightening. It was simply part of the town, filled with rows of graves, stone monuments, trees, and narrow paths. At night, though, no one really wanted to go inside alone. Because we were together, we decided to take the shortcut. We probably made jokes about ghosts before entering. That is what kids do when they are nervous. We acted as if the cemetery did not bother us. The entrance was dark, but we could still see enough to follow the path. There may have been light from the moon, nearby houses, or distant street lamps. It was not completely black, but the graves beyond the path disappeared into shadow. The party behind us became quieter as we walked farther away. At first, we could still hear faint music and voices from the culture house. Then even those sounds faded. Inside the cemetery, everything seemed still. There was no traffic passing nearby. No one else was walking between the graves. Our footsteps sounded louder than normal against the path. We stayed close together without discussing it. None of us wanted to be the person walking several steps behind. The cemetery was not enormous, but at night the distance felt longer. The path passed between rows of graves on both sides. Some had tall headstones. Others were marked by low stones, crosses, or small monuments. Flowers and decorations created shapes that were difficult to identify in the darkness. A bush could look like a crouching person. A tall gravestone could look like someone standing still. We knew that, so we tried not to stare too long at anything. About halfway through the cemetery, something made us stop. I do not remember which one of us noticed it first. There was a grave a short distance from the path. Beside it, or possibly behind it, was the shape of a man. He appeared to be watching us. The figure was dark and still. I could not make out his face. I could not see clear details of his clothing. But the shape looked human. It had the outline of a head and shoulders. It seemed too tall and narrow to be part of the grave itself. For a moment, none of us said anything. We simply stared. The figure did not wave or call out. He did not move away. He remained beside the grave, facing in our direction. I remember looking at my friends. They were both staring toward the same place. The expression on their faces told me they had noticed something too. No one wanted to ask what it was while we were still standing there. There are moments when people understand each other without speaking. All three of us reached the same decision at almost the same time. We ran. We did not walk quickly or continue pretending to be brave. We turned and ran through the rest of the cemetery as fast as we could. Our shoes hit the path hard. I could hear the others breathing and moving beside me. No one looked back for long. I was afraid that if I turned around, the man would no longer be beside the grave. He would be on the path behind us. I also worried about falling. Running through a cemetery at night was dangerous because the path was uneven and the graves were close by. If one of us stepped off the walkway, we could have tripped over a stone or decoration. None of that slowed us down. We kept going until we reached the exit. Once we were outside the cemetery, we stopped and tried to catch our breath. For a few seconds, we only looked at one another. Then one of us asked, "Did you see that man looking at us from the grave?" The question changed everything. Until that moment, each of us could still have believed we had imagined it alone. Maybe I had mistaken a headstone for a person. Maybe the darkness had created a shape that only looked human from my angle. But F1 and F2 had seen it too. They described a man standing near the same grave, watching us. We were shocked. None of us had pointed the figure out while we were inside. No one had said, "Look over there." We had all noticed it separately. We had all looked toward the same grave. We had all become frightened enough to run. That made the experience feel real. If only one person had seen the figure and shouted, the others might have been influenced by the suggestion. In darkness, once someone says there is a man beside a grave, everyone begins seeing a human shape. But that was not what happened. We remained silent until we were outside. Only then did we compare what we had seen. We continued to F2's house, talking about the figure the entire way. Every possible explanation seemed frightening. Maybe it was a real man. Someone could have been visiting a grave late at night. Perhaps he had lost a family member and wanted privacy. There is nothing impossible about a living person standing in a cemetery at 10 o'clock. People visit graves after dark for many reasons. He may have heard us approaching and looked toward the path. From a distance, that ordinary action could have seemed threatening. If that was the explanation, we had frightened ourselves over someone who was simply grieving. But the man's stillness bothered us. He had not called out or reacted when we ran. He seemed to be standing too close to the grave, almost as though he was part of it. We had not seen him walk into the cemetery. There were no other voices, lights, or vehicles nearby. He appeared to be alone. A cemetery worker was another possibility, although the hour made that unlikely. Someone might have been repairing a grave, cleaning decorations, or checking the property. But a worker would probably carry a flashlight or tools. We saw no light near the figure. It was also late for anyone to be working. The figure could have been a statue or large headstone. Many graves have carved angels, saints, crosses, or human-shaped monuments. In low light, a monument can look exactly like a person. The shape may have been part of the grave all along. The angle of the path could have hidden the lower section, making it appear that a man was standing behind the stone. That is one of the most reasonable explanations. We were young, already nervous about being in the cemetery, and surrounded by unfamiliar shapes. Our minds may have turned a monument into a watcher. Still, we knew the cemetery fairly well. I do not remember seeing a statue at that grave during the day. The figure also seemed separate from the stone. It appeared to have the natural proportions of a living person. A tree or bush could also have created the outline. Branches often resemble arms and shoulders in darkness. A narrow tree trunk behind a headstone might form the shape of a body. Leaves moving slightly could make it seem that the figure was turning toward us. But I do not remember wind or visible movement. The figure seemed completely still. That stillness may actually support the idea that it was an object. A real person would probably shift their weight, turn their head, or move their arms. If we watched for several seconds and saw no motion, perhaps we were staring at a stone, tree, or decoration. Fear made the lack of movement seem unnatural. when it may have been evidence that nothing alive was there. Lighting could have played a role, too. The area behind the grave may have been darker than the path. A patch of shadow between two monuments could form a human outline. Our eyes were adjusting to uneven light as we moved from the brighter area near the culture house into the cemetery. In low light, peripheral vision is better at detecting movement, but worse at seeing detail. A vague shape can seem much clearer than it really is. Once the brain recognizes a person, it becomes difficult to see the shape any other way. All three of us were walking close together and looking from nearly the same angle. That could explain why we made the same mistake independently. The figure may have been an actual person who did not mean any harm. That possibility is almost as disturbing as the supernatural one. If a man was hiding beside a grave at night, why was he watching a group of children? Maybe he was only surprised to see us. Perhaps we had interrupted him doing something private or illegal. He could have been drinking, sleeping, stealing decorations, or waiting for someone. Running away was probably still the safest response. We did not know him. We were young. The cemetery was empty. Even if the situation was completely ordinary, there was no reason to approach. When we told our parents, they laughed. They said we had frightened ourselves and were hallucinating. I do not think they meant we were having real medical hallucinations. They probably meant we had imagined a man because we were in a cemetery at night. To them, the explanation was simple. 3 children took a shortcut through a dark cemetery, saw a grave marker or shadow, and turned it into a ghost story. The fact that all 3 of us saw it did not convince them. They believed we had influenced one another or interpreted the same object incorrectly. That is possible. Group fear can spread very quickly. One person stops. The others stop because they notice the reaction. Everyone looks in the same direction. Even without words, facial expressions and body language communicate danger. The first person may see a man. The second sees only a shadow, but assumes it must be the same thing. By the time the group runs, everyone remembers seeing a clear figure. Memory can become more similar when people discuss an event afterward. We may have started with slightly different impressions and gradually created one shared version. Perhaps F1 saw a headstone, F2 saw a bush, and I saw a person. After one of us asked about the guy, all of us adopted that description. That is a rational explanation. But I remember the moment before we ran. I looked at both of them. They were not looking at me for guidance. They were looking directly at the grave. Their fear appeared at the same time as mine. No one had to explain what was wrong. We all saw enough to believe someone was standing there. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if we had returned during the day. We could have identified the grave and looked for a statue, tree, or unusual monument. Maybe the answer would have been obvious. We might have laughed at ourselves after seeing a tall headstone shaped like a person. Or we might have found nothing there that could create the figure. I do not remember going back to check. Even if we passed through the cemetery again, we may not have known the exact grave. At night, everything had looked different. We had been running when we left, and fear does not preserve directions well. The figure became connected to a general section of the cemetery rather than one clearly marked place. That meant we lost the best chance to explain it. Had we gone back the next morning, there might have been signs of a visitor, fresh footprints, flowers moved near the grave, a candle, an empty bottle. Anything that suggested a real person had stood there. Without checking, we were left with memory alone. The adults' reaction made us question ourselves. When parents laugh at a childhood fear, children often stop discussing it. We may continue believing something happened, but we learn that no one wants to hear about it. The 3 of us knew what we had seen, or at least believed we knew. Our parents were certain we had imagined it. There was no way to prove either side. The cemetery did not produce another witness. No man followed us out. Nothing happened later at F2's house. The story ended with us running. That makes a natural explanation more likely. If the figure were a ghost or other entity, there was no additional event to support that conclusion. It did not disappear in front of us. It did not move through a grave. It did not call our names. It simply stood there. Everything supernatural came from the setting and our inability to identify it. A motionless human shape in a cemetery at night naturally feels paranormal. The same shape beside a bus stop might be dismissed as a person waiting. Context changes fear. Still, the location mattered because the figure seemed connected to one grave. It was not standing on the main path. It was not walking toward an exit. It appeared to be watching from the place where someone had been buried. For children already aware that we were surrounded by the dead, that was enough. The cemetery's shortcut had seemed like a small adventure when we entered. Halfway through, it felt as though we had attracted the attention of something that belonged there. There is also the possibility that we encountered someone involved in a local tradition. In some places, families visit graves at night, light candles, pray, or sit with the dead. The person may have been performing a private ritual. Our presence could have surprised him. He may have stayed still because he did not want to frighten us, or because he assumed we would pass. When we suddenly ran, he might have thought we were simply foolish children. If so, he probably never knew how much the encounter affected us. I would prefer that explanation. A grieving person beside a grave is sad but understandable. A stone shaped like a man is even easier to accept. What I do not like is the possibility that the figure had been aware of us before we noticed it. It was already facing the path. It seemed to be waiting. We did not see someone turn around when they heard footsteps. We looked up and found a man, shaped silhouette, watching. That may be a detail added by fear. In darkness, it is difficult to know where a person's face is pointing. We could not see eyes. We only assumed he was looking at us because the upper body appeared oriented in our direction. A statue or headstone could create the same impression. I remind myself of that whenever I think about it. There were 3 of us, and none of us saw the figure move. No one heard footsteps or breathing. No one saw a face. We saw an outline. The safest conclusion is that something at that grave looked like a man. Whether it actually was a man remains uncertain. The event also taught me that being in a group does not always make a person feel safe. At first, having friends beside me gave me confidence. I thought 3 people were enough to handle a dark cemetery. But when all 3 of us became frightened at once, the fear multiplied. There was no calm person to offer an explanation. No one said, "That is only a statue." No one volunteered to walk closer. We read the same danger in each other's faces. Running became the only possible response. I do not regret it. Even if the figure was a living person, approaching would have been unnecessary. If it was an object, we lost nothing except our pride. And if it was something else, leaving was the best decision we could have made. I have tried to remember whether the figure wore anything distinctive. A hat, a long coat, light or dark clothing. I cannot. I remember only the shape. That lack of detail supports the idea of a visual mistake. A real person close enough to identify should have shown some features. But the cemetery was dark, and we were not standing close to the grave. The outline may be all anyone could have seen under those conditions. The exact distance has also changed in my memory over time. It may have been 20 feet away or much farther. At night, distances become difficult to judge. A small monument nearby can look like a full-sized person farther away. That could explain everything. The object may have been much smaller than we believed. Our minds placed it at the grave and enlarged it into a man. The parents who laughed were probably drawing on experiences of their own. Adults know how easily shadows create figures. They may have walked through the same cemetery many times and seen nothing unusual. From their point of view, children claiming that a man watched them from a grave sounded like imagination. But they were not there. They did not see where the figures stood. They did not watch three people independently become silent. They did not feel the exact moment when an ordinary shortcut stopped feeling ordinary. Even now, I do not say with certainty that we saw a ghost. We may have seen a mourner. We may have seen a statue. We may have mistaken a tree, cross, or headstone for a human body. All of those explanations are more likely than something supernatural. But I also cannot say we saw nothing. There was a shape near that grave. All three of us noticed it. All three of us believed it was a man. We did not discuss it until after we had escaped. That shared reaction is the part I cannot forget. When I remember the cemetery, I first hear our footsteps. Then I see the rows of dark graves on both sides. I remember the distant party behind us and how quickly its music disappeared. I remember reaching the middle, looking toward one particular grave, and seeing someone standing there. No face, no movement, only the outline of a man facing three children who had entered the cemetery because they wanted a shorter walk home. We looked at him. He seemed to look back. Then we ran. Our parents believed the darkness had played a trick on us. Maybe they were right. Perhaps the figure was still there the next morning as an ordinary stone monument, harmless in daylight. But none of us saw a monument that night. We saw a man beside a grave, watching without moving. And the reason we ran was not because one frightened child convinced the others. We ran because all three of us had already seen him before anyone said a word. My parents bought an old farmhouse in the middle of nowhere in northeastern Pennsylvania when I was young. The house already had a long history before we moved into it. At some point, my parents built a large addition that almost doubled its size. Because of that, we always thought of the house as having two separate sections, the original old farmhouse and the newer addition. Most of the bedrooms and living areas were eventually spread between those two sections, but my older sister's bedroom was unusual because it was the only bedroom located entirely on the old side of the house. There were a few details about the property that, looking back, sound almost too perfect for a ghost story. About half a mile down the road, there had once been a dam where a group of teenagers died in a tragic accident many years before. The story, as it was told to us, involved several young people who had gone out on the water in small rowboats. Some of the girls were wearing the heavy layered clothing that was normal at the time, including thick petticoats. One of the boats capsized. The boys jumped into the water to try to rescue the girls. Another boat came over to help and also overturned. Several of the teenagers drowned. I do not know how much of that story was perfectly accurate after being passed down for generations, but the accident itself was part of the local history. We also had an antique photograph showing our farmhouse before our family owned it. The previous residents were standing outside the house. Most of the photograph was surprisingly clear considering its age. There was one exception. The father of the family had a blurred face. It looked as though he had moved his head while the photograph was being taken. There was probably nothing mysterious about that. Old cameras required people to remain still for longer exposures. If he turned his head at the wrong moment, his face would naturally blur. Still, once strange stories began accumulating around the house, that photograph became another detail everyone remembered. A tragic drowning nearby. An old farmhouse. A family portrait with one blurred face. I know how cliche all of that sounds. If someone were writing a fictional haunting, those would probably be the first details they included. At the time, however, we were not thinking of our lives as a horror story. It was simply our house. We went to school there. We ate dinner there. We argued, watched television, did homework, and lived ordinary lives. The first person who consistently claimed something was wrong was my older sister. She sometimes complained about frightening things happening at night in her bedroom. She heard footsteps. She had terrible dreams. She felt as if someone were standing in the room with her. Sometimes she described a presence without being able to explain what made her feel it. According to her, there was not only one thing in the house. She believed there were multiple entities. She described a woman, a man, and something else that felt angry. I do not remember her ever giving us a perfect description of any of them. It was more about different impressions. One presence felt female. One felt male. Another did not feel like either of those and was much more threatening. At the time, the rest of us did not know what to do with those claims. She was young. Children and teenagers become frightened at night. Old houses make noises. Wood expands and contracts. Pipes knock. Animals move inside walls. Floorboards shift. Wind passes through imperfect windows. If someone is already nervous, every ordinary sound becomes evidence that something is there. So the family generally treated it as a fear of the dark. My sister would sometimes leave her bedroom and sleep in mine because she did not want to spend the night alone on the old side of the house. I did not understand why she was so scared. As far as I was concerned, nothing had ever happened to me. I thought she was just more sensitive than the rest of us. Maybe she had nightmares. Maybe she scared herself by thinking too much about the house. I was not completely cruel about it, but I definitely thought she was overreacting. That changed somewhat when other people began describing things independently. One of the strangest stories involved a boyfriend she had in high school. He was visiting the house one day and was sitting alone in her bedroom while waiting for her to finish getting ready. He was sitting on the bed. The staircase was directly outside her bedroom. According to him, he suddenly heard someone coming up the stairs. Not light footsteps. Heavy, stomping steps. The sound became louder as it approached the top. He expected my sister, one of our parents, or another family member to appear. Instead, no one came through the doorway. Then he looked toward the carpet. He said he saw footprints appearing in it. Not dirty shoe prints. The carpet itself was being pressed downward one step at a time, as though an invisible person were walking across it. One indentation appeared. Then, another. The footprints moved from the doorway toward the bed. He watched them approach him. He could not see legs. He could not see a body. He could only see the carpet depressing under invisible weight. The marks stopped beside him. Then the mattress moved. He said the bed dipped and shook, as if another person had suddenly sat down next to him. Immediately after that, he felt two hands grab his shoulders. There was no one visible there. That was enough for him. He ran out of the house. My sister eventually found him outside, pacing around and terrified. He did not want to remain in the building. I was not present in the room, so everything I know about that event comes from what he told my sister and what was later repeated in the family. There are possible explanations. Old mattresses shift. Springs release tension. A person sitting on one side can cause another part of the mattress to move. Carpet fibers can change shape depending on lighting. If someone hears footsteps and becomes frightened, shadows across textured carpet might look like impressions appearing. The sensation of hands on the shoulders could come from panic, muscle tension, or even clothing moving suddenly. Once fear begins, Several unrelated sensations can connect into one terrifying event. But his reaction was difficult to dismiss. Whatever he experienced was real enough to make him leave the house and refuse to remain inside. My father eventually had an experience of his own. This happened on the old side of the house, too. He was home alone while the rest of us were at church. Some electronics began turning on by themselves. I do not remember every device involved, only that they were producing static. Old televisions and radios could make plenty of strange noises, especially when receiving weak signals. My father heard something in that static, a voice. It sounded as though someone were whispering directly to him through the noise. That frightened him badly enough that he left the house. When the rest of us returned from church, we found my father outside in the yard. He was wearing only a t-shirt and his underwear. He looked terrified. That image has always stayed with me because my father was not the kind of person I expected to flee his own house half-dressed. Whatever happened, he had been frightened enough that putting on pants became less important than getting outside. Even with stories like that, our family never transformed the house into some huge paranormal obsession. That may sound impossible. If your sister claims invisible people are in her bedroom, her boyfriend says something walked across the carpet and grabbed him, and your father waits outside in his underwear because electronics whispered to him, you would think the family would immediately call someone, move away, or start investigating. We did not. We had normal problems to deal with. School, work, bills, relationships, family arguments, meals, appointments. The strange incidents were rare enough that it was easier to ignore them. I think denial played a large part. People are very good at returning to normal after something they cannot explain. If nothing happens the next day, you go to work. If the television behaves normally again, you stop thinking about the whisper. If your sister sleeps through the night, everyone relaxes. Months can pass. Eventually, the impossible story becomes family trivia. And throughout my entire childhood, I personally experienced nothing. That was another reason I remained skeptical. The stories mostly came from other people. My sister was frightened of her room. I was not. Her boyfriend had his experience. I had not seen it. My father heard a voice. I had been away at church. Occasionally, I would get an uncomfortable feeling in certain parts of the house, especially on the old side, but that was easy to explain after hearing everyone else's stories. If people repeatedly tell you a room is haunted, eventually you feel something when you enter it. Expectation changes perception. So as far as I was concerned, we lived in a normal old farmhouse, and my sister was simply more afraid of strange noises than I was. By the time I graduated from high school, my parents had divorced. We were preparing to move out and sell the house. I had already gotten a small apartment near the college where I had enrolled. Most of our belongings had been removed. The farmhouse was becoming empty. Anyone who has moved out of a family home knows how strange that stage feels. Rooms that once seemed small suddenly look enormous after the furniture is gone. Sound travels differently. Every footstep echoes. The house no longer feels completely lived in, but it has not yet become someone else's home. One afternoon, a friend and I drove back to the old house to pick up a few remaining things. If I am being completely honest, one of our main goals was also to raid whatever had been forgotten in the liquor cabinet. We were young. The house was mostly empty. No parents were there. It felt like an opportunity. My friend and I separated while looking around. He went upstairs into the newer section of the house. I remained downstairs on the old side. At some point, I heard a cell phone ringtone. This was during the era when phones commonly used simple polyphonic melodies. The ringtone was playing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. I assumed it was my friend's phone. The music stopped. Then it started again. I called upstairs and told him to answer his phone. He did not respond. A little later, the ringtone played again. I became annoyed. I shouted louder for him to answer it. Still nothing. Finally, I walked upstairs to find out why he kept ignoring me. As I reached the hallway, my friend appeared from the other direction. He looked irritated, too. He told me to answer my phone. I stopped. My phone? He said he had been hearing my ringtone going off and had been calling for me to answer it. Neither of us had an incoming call. We both checked our phones. No ringing. No missed call that explained what we were hearing. Then the melody began again. Twinkle, twinkle, little star. This time we were standing together. We followed the sound. It did not seem to be coming from either of us. We moved through the hallway, listening. The melody led us toward a bookshelf. That was strange enough by itself. The house was mostly empty, but a number of old books had been left behind. I began running my finger along the spines while the music continued. Then I reached one particular book. The title was Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. The music stopped immediately. For a few seconds, my friend and I simply stared at the book. Then we pulled it from the shelf. It was one of those children's books with a small electronic sound mechanism built into it. Opening it was supposed to play the melody, similar to musical greeting cards. That should have solved the mystery. A children's music book had been malfunctioning. The mechanism had activated by itself. Maybe the movement of the house, humidity, or a failing switch caused it to play. Then we opened the book. Nothing happened. We tried again. No music. The batteries appeared dead. The book had been sitting there since my sister and I were children. It had probably been untouched for years. The contacts were old. The batteries had lost their power. We pressed whatever buttons or switches we could find. We could not make the melody play again. That was where the incident stopped being funny. Moments earlier, we had both heard the song repeatedly from different parts of the house. It had been clear enough that each of us assumed the other person's cell phone was ringing. The music continued while we searched for it. Then I touched the correct book and it stopped. Now the device could not produce a sound at all. Inside the book was an inscription from my parents to my sister. I do not remember the exact wording anymore, but it was something affectionate about her following her star. That detail made the whole thing feel personal. The old house was almost empty. We were preparing to leave it forever. My sister, the person who had experienced the most frightening things there, was no longer living in that bedroom. Then, an old childhood book connected specifically to her began playing its song. I had spent my entire childhood believing everyone else's paranormal experiences were exaggerated. Now I had something of my own. Even then, I tried to find a normal explanation. Old batteries are not always completely dead. A battery that appears unable to power a device continuously can sometimes produce a short burst under the right conditions. Temperature changes can affect voltage. Corroded contacts can briefly reconnect if the device shifts. A failing switch might repeatedly trigger. The house was being emptied, so vibrations from walking around could have disturbed the book. Maybe enough residual charge remained to play the melody a few times and then finally disappeared. The fact that it stopped when I touched the book could have been mechanical. My finger may have shifted the book and broken an unstable electrical contact. That would explain why it never played again when opened. In fact, from an electrical point of view, that explanation is much more reasonable than a ghost using a children's book to communicate. But standing in that hallway, the timing felt impossible. The melody had drawn both of us together. It had led us to the bookshelf. It continued until I reached the exact book. Then, it stopped, and the book belonged emotionally to my sister, the person who had always insisted that the old side of the house was occupied by things the rest of us could not see. My friend and I laughed, not because it was genuinely funny, but because nervous laughter was easier than admitting we were frightened. We started daring each other. If the book was haunted, one of us said, "Why not take it?" Maybe we wanted to prove we were not scared. Maybe we were doing the typical young man thing where fear turns into stupid confidence because no one wants to admit they would rather leave something alone. Eventually, we decided to bring the book back to my apartment. That is where the story becomes less certain for me. The farmhouse incident is something I trust my memory about. My friend was there. We both heard the ringtone. We both traced it to the same shelf. The book would not play afterward. What happened at my apartment could have involved a prank. One of my roommates had a particularly mean sense of humor and would absolutely have enjoyed frightening me if he knew I thought the book was haunted. My apartment was very small. There were only 3 main rooms. My bedroom was on one end. My roommates slept in the middle room. The third room was beyond them, farthest from where I slept. I placed the book in that far room. Over the next several nights, I began hearing things moving around in there, not small noises. It sounded as though the room were being trashed. Objects fell. Things seemed to be thrown around. There were loud crashes and shifting noises. From my bed, I could hear activity in the room beyond where my roommates slept. I was too frightened to investigate. That sounds embarrassing now. I was old enough to know better than to hide in bed because of noises in another room. But after what had happened at the farmhouse, every crash became connected to the book. I would lie still and listen. Something would bang. Another object would move. Then silence. The strange part was that my roommates never seemed especially concerned. That should probably have made me suspicious. If they were genuinely hearing a room being destroyed every night, they would have commented. They might have gotten up and checked. Instead, they seemed strangely uninterested. One explanation is obvious. They were doing it. One or both of them could have been sneaking into the far room, throwing things around, then returning to bed. They knew I had brought home a supposedly haunted book. They knew I was unsettled by it. It would have been an easy prank. My roommate, with the crueler sense of humor, would have found the entire situation hilarious. Another possibility is that the building itself made noises. Apartments contain neighbors, plumbing, heating systems, walls shared with other units, and objects settling in rooms. A crash that seemed to come from the third room might actually have come from the neighboring apartment. At night, when everything is quiet, sound becomes difficult to locate. Once I expected the room to be haunted, every noise came from there in my mind. I may also have been half asleep during some incidents. A person drifting between sleep and wakefulness can hear real sounds and interpret them dramatically. Still, after several nights, I had enough. Whether the cause was paranormal, roommates, or my own anxiety, I wanted the book gone. I took it to the window. The apartment was on the 3rd floor. There was a narrow gap between our building and the building beside it. I opened the window and threw the book out. It fell all the way down into that space. I did not go retrieve it. I did not carefully dispose of it or give it away. I wanted distance. After that, the apartment became quiet again. That ending sounds almost too perfect. Haunted object arrives. Strange noises begin. Haunted object gets thrown away. Noises stop. I understand why anyone hearing the story would assume I had built the sequence in my memory afterward. If my roommates were pranking me, throwing away the book would also naturally end the prank. There was no longer anything to tease me about. If anxiety caused me to misinterpret normal apartment noises, Removing the object could have calmed me enough that I stopped paying attention. The sounds may have continued, but they no longer felt connected to a threat. That is probably just as likely as anything supernatural. What matters more to me is the farmhouse itself. For most of my childhood, I had been the skeptical one. My sister claimed things happened to her. Her boyfriend had his terrifying experience. My father had run out of the house after hearing a voice in electronic static. I had shrugged it all off because nothing had ever happened directly to me. Then, near the very end of our time there, when the house was almost empty and we were preparing to leave it behind, something finally did. An old book connected to my sister began playing a melody even though its batteries seemed dead. Maybe that was all it was. A dying battery. A corroded contact. A tiny switch activated by movement. There is nothing impossible about an old electronic toy behaving unpredictably. But the inscription inside the book has always stayed with me. Something about following her star. And the song was Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. If I choose the comforting interpretation, I like to imagine one of the gentler presences my sister believed lived in that old house was trying to reach out one last time. Not the angry thing she feared. Maybe the woman. Maybe the man. Maybe nothing more than a failing music circuit in an old children's book. But if there was something there, I liked the idea that it knew we were leaving. The house that had been full of our family for years was becoming empty. My parents were divorced. My sister was gone. I had moved into an apartment near college. Soon strangers would own the place. Perhaps whatever remained there understood that our connection to the house was ending. Maybe the song was not meant for me at all. Maybe I was only the person who happened to hear it. The book had belonged to my sister. The message inside had been written to her. If anything was saying goodbye, perhaps it was saying goodbye to the person who had noticed it first. I eventually became much more interested in paranormal subjects because of that experience. I read stories. I researched hauntings. I began looking into theories about spirits, residual energy, electronic voice phenomena, and haunted objects. At one point, I even formed a paranormal investigation group. What began as curiosity slowly became something I thought about far too often. Every strange sound became something to investigate. Every dark building became a possibility. Every personal story seemed like another piece of evidence. Eventually, I stopped. The subject was affecting my daily life. Whether paranormal things exist or not, constantly searching for them was making me anxious and obsessive. I found myself watching for signs instead of simply living. So I deliberately created distance. Even now, I maintain a kind of mental barrier between myself and this subject. I do not spend hours researching hauntings anymore. I try not to stare too deeply into every strange coincidence. Part of me believes that giving these things too much attention makes you more open to them. Maybe I mean that literally. Maybe I only mean that the more attention you give fear, the more your mind begins to find it everywhere. Both possibilities lead to the same practical conclusion. Sometimes it is healthier not to investigate every unexplained noise. I still enjoy hearing other people's experiences. I still wonder what happened in our farmhouse. I am not completely convinced that everything my sister, her boyfriend, my father, and I experienced can be reduced to imagination. But I am also not willing to claim that the house definitely contained ghosts. There are reasonable explanations for almost every piece. My sister's footsteps and presence could have been nightmares, sleep paralysis, old house noises, and fear. Her boyfriend's footsteps and moving carpet might have been suggestion and perception. The bed could have shifted under his own weight. The feeling of hands on his shoulders could have been panic. My father's electronics could have malfunctioned. Human brains are extremely good at finding voices in static. The old book could have had just enough battery power remaining for one final malfunction. My apartment noises could have been roommates playing a joke. None of those explanations are ridiculous. They may be correct. But taken together, the incidents created a history our family never completely forgot. The strangest part is how normal life remained around them. The house did not become a place of constant terror. There were birthdays there, Christmas mornings, homework, arguments, meals, friends visiting, people laughing. Then, every once in a while, something happened that did not fit. My sister would leave her bedroom because she felt watched. A boyfriend would run outside because invisible footsteps crossed the floor toward him. My father would wait in the yard in his underwear because a voice came through static. Years later, after most of us had already moved away, a dead children's book would begin singing from a shelf. Maybe that is why the story has stayed with me. The strange things did not replace ordinary life. They interrupted it. For a few minutes, the house seemed to reveal another layer. Then everything returned to normal, leaving whoever experienced it to wonder whether it had happened at all. Of all the incidents, the ringtone is the one I trust most because I was finally there. My friend heard it independently. He was upstairs thinking my phone was ringing. I was downstairs thinking his phone was ringing. We met in the middle of the house, annoyed with each other. Then the song played again while both of our phones remained silent. We followed it together. My finger moved across the books. Twinkle, twinkle, little star. The music stopped. We pulled out the book. We opened it. Nothing. Dead batteries. Silence, an inscription to my sister about following her star. That is what I remember. Maybe the book simply gave one final electrical gasp after years on the shelf. Maybe my touching it broke the last bit of corrosion, keeping the circuit active. That explanation is entirely possible. But after growing up in a house where my sister repeatedly insisted that more than one unseen presence lived on the old side, I still find the timing strange. The house waited until almost everyone was gone. It waited until I, the person who had never experienced anything, came back one afternoon. Then, something connected to my sister began playing from a forgotten bookshelf. For years, I thought my sister was simply afraid of the dark. By the time I finally had my own experience, there was almost no one left in the house to tell. Maybe that was coincidence. Maybe that old book had one final dying battery. Or maybe, just before we closed the door on that farmhouse for good, something that had spent years trying to get my sister's attention finally realized she was not coming back and used the only thing it had left to say goodbye.
So that's where we'll stop tonight. Before you go, remember this. Every story you just heard was real. Real people, real nights, and none of them saw it coming. If that got to you the way it gets to most people, do one thing before you leave. Hit subscribe. I post new stories all the time, and I don't want you to miss them. Take care of yourself. I'll see you next time.